So this is a session on social innovation and social change. And I guess to do a bit of scene setting, I just want to put in context that 26 years of economic growth, and we've started to hear some of that as we've been going today. But here's some other facts, numbers for you. On any given night in Australia, 1 in 200 people are homeless. We have had a 14% increase in homelessness between the last two censuses. We have 17.5% of our children under 15 years of age living in households that are in poverty. 2.4 million households are living in financial stress or severe financial vulnerability. And we heard earlier that 1 in 3 of our young people are either unemployed or underemployed. In this country, if you have a mental health problem or if you have a disability, you are still far less likely to be employed. And if you're lucky enough to have a job, you're more likely to be underemployed. That is, you want more hours, but you can't get them. We have a digital exclusion problem. For those of you talking about AI and the internet, it is a particular issue for people who cannot get access to the internet, do not have money to use the internet, or do not have the skills to do so. That's particularly the case for our over 65-year-olds, those living in rural communities, and our Indigenous Australians in some cases. The report that we saw released this morning from CEDA on the Community Pulse found 79% of people that were surveyed thought it was not very acceptable or unacceptable that we had this big gap between the richest and the poorest in Australian society. 79% of people surveyed. I think what's interesting about that for me is, as far as the other 21% of people are concerned, who think that that might be okay, one of my favourite things about systems thinking is that a problem in the system is everybody's problem. A problem in the system is everybody's problem. Countries that have smaller gaps between the richest and the poorest do better economically. If we flip Scott Morrison, the Treasurer's comment this morning around saying that we need a strong economy to support our social infrastructure and social support system, we can flip that to think about, if we don't have a strong society, we don't have a vibrant, thriving economy. If people don't have money, they don't have anywhere to invest, they won't be investing in businesses and businesses will shrink. We heard this morning about the costs of not tapping into productivity of our young people. We know the costs of mental health issues in this country, and I could probably go on to give you a fairly long list. A problem in the system is everyone's problem. And if we're going to shift this, we need to look beyond siloed responsibilities. We need to look beyond the traditional sectors of government, not-for-profits and corporates. And in fact, we're starting to see this trend. At the Centre for Social Impact, we talk about a social purpose ecosystem. We're seeing new people enter the space. We have social entrepreneurs, we have social intrapreneurs, we've got social enterprises. Corporates are starting to introduce things like shared value. We're seeing new funding mechanisms like social impact investment. We're seeing new types of collaboration in different locations, for example, like collective impact. And there's a whole lot of new novel ideas, but I'm not going to spoil those because our panellists will probably bring up a few. And we're seeing changes in the way that funding is exchanged. We no longer have governments giving money to not-for-profits and not-for-profits supporting individuals. The NDIS, for example, is about giving the individuals the funding and then them giving out the funding to the organisations they want to work with. The landscape around the expectations is also changing. We heard our Deputy Treasurer talk about not wanting to waste a tax dollar this morning. And interestingly, there's been an increasing shift on expectations that for the money that people have, whether you're a not-for-profit or another, what are the outcomes that you're actually producing for those dollars? There is a demand for better evidence and better data and more accountability. As a result, the Centre for Social Impact has recently launched a project called Amplify Social Impact, where we're actually using technology to better understand the social issues we're facing, how we're tracking over time, to provide organisations with indicators to measure that and the ability to benchmark in the longer term. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to come over and kick off with the panellists. But between here and there, I'm going to get Rosemary to start to think about this notion of going back to, is this really a social problem, or is this something that we need to think about from an economic positioning?
Thanks, Kristy, and thanks for the fantastic introduction. I think there's three things we need to think about when we're thinking about the social and economic. The view we come from is that they are absolutely connected, and that if we don't start to work through how we understand those connections and address some of the social issues, that there are three key risks. The first is that we entrench the disconnect that we've been talking about and that comes through so strongly in the community pulse, and that we get stuck in this zero-sum game. The second is that we leave a lot of capital and talent sitting on the sidelines that could actually be driving both social and economic progress and prosperity. And the third is that we actually start to lose our competitive advantage as other countries step up to this challenge much more proactively and step in to make sure that they can actually drive the change that's going to see progress made and productivity in the sense of growing the pie for everybody. Just to explore those three really briefly, entrenching the disconnect, if we buy into the sense that the limits of what we can do to address social issues are driven by what government alone can do, then we limit ourselves to a pool of capital that is simply not sufficient when we look at the rising demand and what people have said matters to them. If we do that, then we might be making different choices depending on the complexion of the politics of the day, but we're actually going to be saying to a whole lot of people, we're really sorry you miss out. And we risk continually being caught in a cycle where we're addressing the consequences of the social issues rather than actually meeting them at their cause. And it would be really unfortunate to do that at a point where the global trends are actually pointing towards not only innovation and enterprise, but a whole raft of players who traditionally have been focused much more on the financial and economic, actually focusing their attention on how the social issues are creating systemic risks to longer-term financial performance and asking how they can understand that better. For example, look at the Dutch pension funds actively engaging in turning some of their portfolios to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, and starting to map their portfolios to better understand what is it that they're doing that's avoiding harm, what is it that's actually contributing solutions, and what is it they can't account for the social impacts that it's having. We're seeing entrepreneurs wanting to actively tackle social issues, and there's fantastic examples right here in Australia, like Ability Mate, that's 3D printing splints for kids with cerebral palsy, bringing down the cost and improving the outcomes for families. And we're seeing corporates look to different ways of working that include social solutions as opening up new markets. People want more opportunities to invest aligned with their values. Australian Ethical is the fastest growing superannuation fund in this country. Last week, the UK said we're going to respond to people's desire to have those opportunities, and we're actually going to regulate that pension funds need to disclose what impacts they're having and where they're putting their money so that people can make better choices. This is a window of opportunity for innovation, and the good news is we know what the toolbox is for that. We use it in economic policy. We can adapt it for getting better outcomes in social policy as well. And the third area that we need to pay attention to is our competitive advantage. Michael Porter, the Harvard economist who gave us the competitive theory of nations, said in Oxford in 2012, when we left the social and environmental out of competition policy, it was a huge mistake. Those of you who've seen his writing with Mark Kramer on shared value know that he now is advocating that not only is it important we work out how to reintegrate social and environmental with the economic and financial, but that the future of markets depends on it. That the new market opportunities are going to be where there's been underserved areas, where we've mispriced the risk, Look at groups like Leapfrog investing in microinsurance through our region. Look at funds like Bridges, who are got leading private equity firm in the UK, and they drive investment into communities where people have been doing it tough. In fact, 60% of the investments from their first fund went into the bottom 10% of communities by social and economic indicators, and they returned 15% net to their investors. These opportunities are opening up. Other governments, including the UK, are saying this is a source of competitive advantage, and as Australia, we can and should be part of that, and we can and should be taking a leadership position.
Thanks, Rosemary. That was a pretty impressive wrap-up. I want to pick up on that piece around the future of markets depends upon it. And if we go to this question of what this panel is supposed to be addressing, how can technology, innovative social ventures and cross-sectoral collaboration solve entrenched social issues that have challenged traditional government policies and programs approaches? Big question. Is this just idealistic? Is it something that sounds visionary, that the future of markets depend upon it, that we can combine the social and the economic? Is this sort of a visionary dream, Michael, or is this something that we can actually do pragmatically and feasibly?
No, thanks, Kristy. And Rosemary's outlining of the opportunity and the challenge around fusing business and business discipline for social purpose, I think, sits at the heart of this. And I'll come back to what I think is a practical example that builds on what Rosemary's saying about how we can go about this. But I wanted to acknowledge, I think what CEDA is doing is really interesting and powerful work in this. You know, one of the things that drew me after a career at Macquarie Bank to the social purpose sector was going to one too many chief economists' lunch where we were talking in glowing terms about Australia's unprecedented economic growth. And I grew up in a community where I just couldn't see signs that was happening. It was going sideways and backwards at a rate of knots. So this belling the cat on the fact, it doesn't surprise me greatly, and I suspect others in this room, that 75% are saying, yep, I can see senior executives and big corporates are doing okay, but I'm not. And, you know, I certainly for myself, and I think I speak for others in the room, there's a great risk that we live in a bit of a protected bubble and we miss all of that. So I think we've got to think about this game a little differently. The practical example and what I think it says to us, I had the privileged opportunity to be part of a team that brought out of the ashes of bankruptcy the old ABC childcare centres, which was a poster child of a failed privately held enterprise. At its peak, Fast Eddie Groves had grown ABC childcare centres to a market cap of $2.6 billion. All of the major banks were collectively in debt to the tune of over $1 billion. It wasn't particularly well run, and I don't think it was particularly ethically run either. But that created an opportunity for those of us who felt that actually early learning and childcare was something significant at a policy level, because one of the gifts of SVA, the work at Social Ventures, was knowing how profoundly important early learning was to the productivity and education debate. The fact that we were able to raise the $165 million from a group of people who believed, A, that it was possible to do that transaction and generate a reasonable set of returns, but B, it could make some sort of social purpose impact, I think is what the intel inside of the broader opportunity that Rosemary was speaking about can actually achieve. And the opportunity is this: let's deal with bite-sized chunks, because I think the zeitgeist of the times and what the CEDA report highlights is we need a capitalism 2.0. We need a different way of looking at these issues. So the idea that we can actually invest in large-scale organisations at scale that are run with business disciplines for social purpose, I think is entirely achievable. And I was chatting to a couple of attendees here who are fellow colleagues in the industry fund market from Hester and First State, both of whom have been leaders in this space, by the way. Their view and mine is that there's $2.5 trillion in super funds, which is looking for a way to do this constructively. Now, I chair the investment committee at Sunsuper. I'd be in breach of my fiduciary responsibilities if we were to do deals that don't pass muster in terms of economic returns. But in Goodstart, the investors repaid 2 years early, received a 12% annual coupon for what was essentially an infrastructure deal. Sunsuper more recently has invested in an ethical aged care provider, and the returns on that sit at 10 to 10.5%. So these are deals that both pass muster, and if you explode that, how many sectors of the economy, and this has come up in the conversations today, think aged care, think TAFE, think early education. This is not smaller $5 and $10 million fragmented bites of social enterprise. These are multi-$100 million, if not multi billion-dollar chunks of the economy. And if I'm a taxpayer, and I am, I'd frankly rather see government funding, because the truth is at Goodstart, we're a billion-dollar social enterprise with 72,000 families and children. 43% of our revenue next year, bipartisan supported, is in the form of childcare benefits and rebates. As an investor with a taxpayer hat on, would you rather see that redirected for social purpose in the 130 out of 650 centres that we have that are in bottom third decile CEFA postcodes? Think about that for 5 seconds and then answer the question, what can we do about capitalism 2.0? There are big chunks of the economy that are actually waiting for this to happen.
It's a really interesting example, and an example, like you say, that you could see actually start to play out in some of those other sectors. I'm wondering, Cath, what this means at a community level, and, you know, sort of I guess that the early childhood space is a great example of sort of a national piece that then lands in local community. But I know you've been involved in some really, in particular, community-based initiatives, and so I'm wondering if you could talk to how this might play out in a local community.
Thank you. Lendlease is participating with a lot of other organisations in a collective impact model approach to run out one of the first justice reinvestment trials in Australia. So we're one of a number of communities. Bourke is 850 kilometres west of Sydney, so it's a very long way away, and it's less than 3,000 people there, but the community actually made the approach and came to the city and said, you know, we're sick of people coming and writing reports about us and telling us how bad it is in Bourke and how we're performing so badly across most of the crime categories, and it's dismal and everything else. And we want to take things into our own hands. So there was a meeting called in Sydney. A lot of organisations were invited to attend, and a few are still surviving. So we're 5 years into an initial 6 years of a justice reinvestment program. So the concept there, and now we know, but we never knew when we started, $4 million is spent on that Bourke community locking up young people. So nobody knew what the cost to the community was of the impact of young people in Bourke going to jail. So what the community has said is, if we can divert people from jail, if we can prove to you that if we can divert some of that money and put it at the front end to stop people getting locked up in the first place, then it's going to be an overall better social and economic impact, if you like. So we've been going through the New South Wales Parliament. It took many years to pull out data, because what we wanted to do was make sure that it was evidence and data driven, not generic stats, but looking at what is actually happening in Bourke across a whole range of indicators like health, education, attendance at school, as well as the justice impacts. And with that data, we put it back in the hands of the community. So we actually had people trained. We did a big infographic. What does life look like in this little community between the ages of 0 and 25? And if and where do people get in trouble with the law and get impacted and get locked up? And surprisingly, a lot of people are locked up for driving unlicensed, let me tell you that. So when you're talking about how complex these issues are, what we've found is how simplistic and low-hanging a lot of the things are that we can actually do in this space. So something like a driver's licensing program has reduced to 0 people getting warrants for that reason. So I'll go through a couple of the stats in a little while. But what we also found in a town of under 3,000 was there's 60 different service providers: health, aged care service, employment services. And most people in the community didn't know, not everybody had the same view of who they were, what they did, how they interacted, what the services were. There were gaps, there were overlaps, and there were omissions. So one of the early exercises as part of the data gathering was to also map all this whole service provision in town. And there were ludicrous things, like if kids are getting in trouble with the law, there was something like 20 youth counsellors, but not one of them worked past 5 p.m. or on any weekend. The PCYC closed at 4 o'clock on Friday and didn't open till Monday. So there were all these things that were really easy to put in place that could actually have an impact on that community. So we put all this data in the hands of community, and we had some very hard discussions because you'd obviously think a lot of those service providers felt threatened and what are you here for? And the answer is we're here to help everybody do the job better, to share our resources and coordinate the services in the interests and the mission of the community and not necessarily of those 60 individual service providers. The other difficult thing was the community actually taking ownership of the crime stats and, you know, what some of the problems were. So we're well down the track, and if you go to Just Reinvest New South Wales, you can see a lot of this online. Also in the June edition of the Law Society Journal, there's a story on Bourke. But giving this information to the community, they've now formed their own priorities in Bourke. They've formed a men's group, a women's group, a tribal council, a youth council. The service providers are acting in the 3 priority areas that the community have identified to coordinate and work on those services. And I'll just give you an idea over the last 18 months. Just things like the Aboriginal flag being flown in town, that was like a 34-year campaign by people in town. But the police, the Shire Council, so everybody has cooperated on this now. There's a new water park, the school holiday programs are coordinated. We've got these 3 working groups that meet every month, and what we have also is some actual real-time intervention. So 9:30 a.m. every day, the police come to the community referral service that we've got now, and they talk about incidents or people who might have problems over the last 24 hours, and a coordinated plan is put together for that person or that family to address those issues so it doesn't escalate. You know, the police and the courts are using their discretionary powers, but we're talking about a 30% reduction in driving offences. This is from the police in Bourke. 2 cars were stolen this year, down on 30 cars stolen in 2016. Domestic violence cases, 128 down to 71, so nearly half, and the lowest rate in 10 years. Assaults have reduced down from 192 to 132. So I put it, if we give some of this power and some of this information to the community, they will drive and own some of this thing, and it can be very effective, and especially with government, corporations, NGOs, everybody pulling in the one direction over a longer term, not a 3-year horizon of program funding and government cycles.
It's a pretty powerful example of what happens in a community when you actually get collaboration between and across sectors, and you empower individuals within that community to have a whole lot of agency to create their own destiny, basically. I mean, it's interesting because both of those last 2 examples we've just heard are really like impressive stories. And I think, you know, if we think about sort of the financial investment side of things, of say a social impact investment or a collective impact initiative, from a financial perspective, if you're putting a normal investment into a particular financial market, if it fails, somebody's going to lose their money. In a situation where we're talking about, you know, entrenched serious social issues, if it fails, it's going to affect individuals' lives. So I want to throw to any of you, how do we balance this notion of that piece around managing risks and rewards, and then the second piece is, you know, where are the elephants in this room so we don't walk away thinking that actually this is easy?
So in terms of balancing risk and reward, I think we have to get better at making impact count. We have to get better at understanding the data, as Cath was talking about in very real examples, in communities. But what tends to happen is we try and boil the ocean on that. And while we try and get the perfect measures, we're overlooking some of the really basic things that we can be capturing. How many people have jobs? How many didn't have them before? How many of the people that we're creating jobs for come from this community? And when we're not making impact count, we are also ignoring the impacts that some of the business and programmatic decisions that we make have that don't get captured by ex post facto evaluations and the way that we look at things. So it doesn't give us the real-time information to actually make decisions. The people who I have the privilege to work with globally on this, as Kristy said, across 19 countries now and counting, are really focused on how we can bring this to the centre. And what we expect to see is the next evolution in how we think about markets. The next evolution in going from a world where we just looked at the financial returns to the methods that we developed in the last century around risk-adjusted returns so that we could be more nuanced, to a world where we actually say we need to look at impact, risk and return. And the place to start with that is putting impact on the table. And one of the elephants in the room is that when we don't have that conversation, we don't face up to the areas where it's the social issues that are actually creating systemic risks. It's the impacts for people and for the labour markets. It's on a global basis, it's how we deal with water and food security and climate that are actually creating risks that will impact financial performance, and we can be making decisions today for what we want to achieve in the future. And one final elephant in the room is that this isn't about public and private. It's about a way that we can look at options that go beyond those kinds of binary choices. If we can take some of the money that government has and we can actually create a multiplier effect by using it to invite private capital and enterprise into areas that wouldn't go, as you heard the last panel talking about, in terms of regional areas. If we do that in a way that we're designing for the effects we want to see for people and communities, not relying on spillover effects to come through, then we can achieve a lot more. But government's a necessary partner in that, has a huge amount to gain and a huge amount to offer, not just in money and in regulation, but also in data and a range of other expertise that can and should be at the table.
I think that challenge of being very granular about financial performance and social measurement is critical. There's also a big elephant in the room for me, which is pretty simple, and it's the war for talent. An anecdote to highlight what one of the challenges can be with this. I'll never forget bumping into a friend of mine when I was 6 months into the job at Social Ventures, and he said, "Oh, good on you, Traill. It's nice that you're doing that for nothing." Now, I had worked at Macquarie Bank for 15 years where I was pretty well paid. But I worked for a non-profit organisation that I was proud to work for, and I said, no, of course I'm paid. I was paid a sector-appropriate rate, which was a fraction of what I was earning at Macquarie, but I was paid. And I think I would have been doing myself, my family and the organisation a deep disservice if I wasn't. And the point to me is if I look at Goodstart, which if it was publicly listed would probably be top 100, top 200 stock, my bet is that my process as chair in reviewing remuneration and packaging is quite different from the trauma that my peers who are chairs or running the remuneration committees of listed companies are. And I can assure you that people at Goodstart, which is a fabulous talent pool, Julia Davison, who's the CEO, has a health sector and hospital background. The Chief Operating Officer and CFO come from deep commercial backgrounds. All of them could get paid probably 2 or 3x what they're earning at Goodstart. I spend literally 5 minutes doing a package pay rise review with that team, and that's not being disrespectful. That's because their motivation and they love what they're doing is about purpose. So while this might sound doe-eyed, part of the capitalism 2.0 is that I think there is a really significant talent pool and opportunity, and my confident bet is one of the disconnects that the CEDA data shows and highlights is people who are seriously peed off in the mainstream when they read about the massive escalation of packages relative to average weekly earnings. I saw something that Adam Creighton in The Australian wrote in a column a couple of weeks ago, and it talked about packages in a major bank for the top dozen executives in 1997 being about $6.5 million. Wind the clock forward to last year in the same bank, and this would be universal across the 4 banks, the packages for the top dozen executives were $34 million. Now, this is a multiple of 3 to 4 times the rate of growth of that group over a 20-year period. Now, do any of us seriously think that that represents those jobs being that much more difficult? And I know they're tough and complex jobs. And I'm not into pie chucking and throwing darts at what's a pretty soft target in banks at the moment, but there is a universal truth in this, that we have a community that is really aggrieved at that escalation of packages, and the disconnects have to be solved by trying to appeal to the better nature. And there are a bunch of people out there who are motivated by purpose. The sustaining jobs can be reasonably well paid in capitalism 2.0, but we don't have to deal with that, and people don't like that.
I think one of the risks is, and I'm thinking about growing Indigenous businesses here and the impact of the Indigenous procurement policy, which while I do support targets and otherwise some things will not shift whatsoever, that it has to be a sustainable growth. So, we're trying to drive this, but what we're doing, and 92% of new businesses, small, medium enterprise startups fail anyway. And we're putting this enormous pressure on all these very small, nascent Indigenous businesses to take up all this extra work and grow at a totally irresponsible rate. So, we have to be mindful that we need to talk to people and understand what are the risks, what are the aspirations, what is the market, what does success look like to you, and not presume that we have all the answers and knowledge and what we know is best for you is what will happen here. So I think we need to be inclusive in decision making and incorporate some of those ideas and values of the people impacted, because that's where some of the best ideas do live. We heard that from the previous panel.
Some good lessons to heed there. How do we have sustainable growth? How do we find the war on talent and the people who are willing to commit to social good as well as potentially earning enough money to feed their families? And Rosemary's point around combining the piece around impact, risk and reward and not looking at them separately. We are going to go to questions from the floor. While we do that, I'm going to ask these three to think about a question around future. Because it's sort of easy to sort of talk about this, but actually moving beyond the Talkfest piece, we've got treasurers coming to talk to us tonight. So if we're going to ask sticky questions to them or ask them to do something differently, what would that be? If that's too much of a curveball question, what else would you have people from different sectors in the audience sort of do as an action?
Well, we've had great support from the New South Wales Government, who's given us Minister Brad Hazzard to actually manage a whole of government solution, so to bring the different silos together to support what we're doing. So that's definitely one good thing. But from a corporate point of view, I think most of the organisations in this room have sustainability platforms that talk about the SDGs, or some of us might be signatories to the UN Global Compact or have reconciliation action plans like Lendlease does. So I think there's enough drivers there, both commercial and from a sustainability point of view, and we're seeing the social procurement policy and modern day slavery coming behind. I think there won't be a choice in the future. It'll be you have to be there and be playing in this field. The stakeholders and the investors demand it, and the community expectations are high.
Yeah, look, I think consistent with the previous panel, I think government doesn't need to do much more than be an enabler. So, one thing, for example, in the hybrid capitalism 2.0 space, payroll tax exemptions are generally reasonably available for social purpose non-profit organisations, providing there's a granular demonstration that you're delivering on those. That's a reasonable thing for governments to do that provides obviously a relative advantage. But that being tied to appropriate tests, I think is reasonable. But beyond that, it's really about the origination of those deals and a superannuation fund market that I have every confidence will do these deals as they take shape.
I would say at an individual level, I think one of the clearest things people can do is start to get informed. This is happening all around the world, and when we start to ask the questions, when we actually start to create and signal demand, that's the surest way to start to get change. If you ask people internationally, including in large investment banks like Goldman Sachs and UBS, why are they doing this, they will tell you quite clearly their clients want it. Secondly, that we can start to actually get together with people in our own industries or where competition is an issue, to work with research houses or with others to start to put the pieces in place and take action within industries. And if you're short on ideas about what there is to do, we have long lists of ideas that we're very happy to share. The third thing is that we can work with governments, and there are lots of things, like in any field of endeavour, that can be done, but there's a few game changers. Getting real about sharing data is one of those, and Kristy's work at CSI is really significant. The point that Cath makes about reliable funding for some of the organisations to be able to get on and do what they do, but also then working with them to work out what's actually working on the ground. And the thing that we think would really change the game is a wholesale institution that builds on a proven model internationally and from other fields that would prime the pump for intermediaries that exist in the Australian market to grow, and for new ones to develop and create a huge multiplier effect. And again, if people are interested in that, we've got a lot of work that's been done with a group of cross-sector leaders in Australia, and very happy to share that.
Thanks. We could write a blog on how easy it is to use social innovation to create social change out of all of those ideas. I guess the one thing I wanted to pick up on is that point around the clients want it. And it's interesting because, you know, the young people who are the cream of the crop coming out of universities who are actually being hounded for the best jobs, they also do not want to work for organisations who actually aren't willing to commit to some kind of social change. And it's really interesting how many of our undergrads we're now seeing voting with their feet around picking up subjects like we and other universities offer around creating social change, whether they're engineers or business students or whoever. So it's a real push that's coming. We have a question at the front, just here.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm the head of Impact for HESTA. And because I've got the microphone, I've got two questions, a bit cheeky, but very short one, Cath. The relationship between Lendlease and Justice Reinvest, is it philanthropic, or is there not a relationship there?
No, there are philanthropic organisations who are funding those roles in Bourke, which we're zeroed now to about 17 Aboriginal people doing this work in Bourke. Lendlease role has largely been my project management time and pro bono advice and support of community leadership.
So they're not expecting a return? There's no social...
No, there's no social return on it. There's no investment as yet. But when we cost this, the savings and whatnot, we can probably put it out to a market then, as well as ask government for the funding to show, to reinvest in what the savings that we can prove are, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So my second question then is, I think, can be slightly related. One of the survey results this morning was about access to affordable housing being a top priority for people of the nation, and it's something that super funds are often charged to solve without having really being able to get under what the policy ask is, what the nuanced asks are of different levels of government. Does the panel have any thoughts on the affordable housing question in Australia and how investment might be directed that way?
Yeah, so this question, which is so current around the ability to provide social, affordable NDIS housing, we've looked, and we're in the process of looking at developing a fund that tries to find those larger scale deals. So we've actually, this kind of a live and sweaty question, been looking at a number of opportunities. The short answer to your question is I think yes, there are, but we've got to be very careful to structure those deals that fit on the risk return curve for the mainstream funds. So as best I can tell, the solution to that requires some creative thinking where they're what I'd call kind of salt and pepper development. So there's a hybrid of social and affordable, conventional retail where you can effectively cross-subsidise some of the returns, and there's some accommodation that in part government might need, or a non-profit service provider, a lot of whom have pretty lazy, underutilised national balance sheets. And if you look at the yields on those in the modelling that we've been doing on a couple of practical transactions, that gets you to kind of 8 or 9%, and there's a sweet spot there that I think fits the risk return spectrum for infrastructure characteristics that the major super funds would be looking for. But it's such a large scale need, it's crying out for some creative solutions, and we've seen some good things happen on a smaller scale, and HESTA's certainly been a big part of that.
There's some fantastic examples internationally of this, and to us part of the key is actually blended capital models, which is a variation on what Michael's talking about in his salt and pepper, where you've got foundation or government money that would otherwise be coming into social and affordable housing being used to bring private capital out of its comfort zone. And the price that they're asking is to be able to do more by leveraging that private capital. So, for example, if you're a foundation and for argument's sake you've got $100 million to spend on affordable housing, that only goes so far. If you can use that to leverage a significant amount of private capital, you can do a lot more. But the price, if you like, that they're looking for is actually to say we want the service providers talking with the housing providers, and we want this to be designed in a way that it's not just about more, it's better. And so examples include the Healthy Futures Fund, which is a collaboration between Morgan Stanley and the Kristy Foundation. Kristy and Rockefeller have just put more money on the table to seed fund initiatives into new communities. There are initiatives like the Living Cities and Bridges Funds Management, who I mentioned before, have just been doing a development like the one that Michael talked about, where they have got a significant proportion of social and affordable housing. We can and should be doing that in Australia, particularly with the history we have of listed property funds and infrastructure development.
Do we have another question? Up the back, thank you.
It's Damien Graham from First State Super. I was just going to make a comment, and Michael and I were talking about this over lunch to a degree, but I think one of the challenges in Australia particularly, and we as a fund have probably looked at 25 to 30 different projects around affordable housing and social, but unlike overseas, it's very challenging here because the cost of land is so high, and it just makes it very difficult to get the economics to work. And I think the social housing, particularly in our minds, is unfortunately probably lands more towards the public good than affordable may. And if you can get a blended outcome for affordable and at market, then you may be able to get the numbers to work. But it's a very challenging outcome because, as Michael says, the need is so huge, particularly at the social end. But the cost of the inputs are so high in Australia that it doesn't stack up at the moment at scale. Sorry, no question. I was just making a comment. Apologies for that.
It's a really important comment, and I guess playing off that and to Rosemary's point, where we see social impact investing working, particularly in the affordable or homelessness space overseas, all of the examples use blended capital. And so that's why they tend to be successful in the US and the UK, where we've seen property funds, for example, being used to untap more affordable housing. And so I think, that piece around the cost of land and what you've been looking at it being feasible or not feasible, we should go back to who do you collaborate with to untap some of that land that's more affordable. And, an opportunity could be, for example, and I don't want to out them publicly too much, but I recently was at one of the big religious organisations' internal conferences, and they've got a heap of land that is either empty and or has buildings on it that is not being used, and their whole mission is about social purpose. And so it's a classic example where, get the right partnership and actually you can solve part of that problem. Last question. Anyone else? No. Okay, well, to the panel. Oh, yeah, there is one more.
Kate Gaynor here from Uniting Care Australia. So I guess this is an impression from across the day so far. And it's interesting that the word public good was just used. In the contexts you're talking about, do you see public good as being a relevant term still? Is it a relevant concept, or is it something whose day has come? Especially after reading the ABC Childcare Royal Commission report, where they identified childcare as being a public good.
Yeah, so the question is, how explicit should we or can we be in that financial context about public good? It's a very pertinent question. I think there's actually a fusion between those two, and it actually goes back to part of the conversation Damien and I were having over lunch, which is I think there's an alignment. Increasingly what the industry funds, super funds are looking for is a 10, 20-year ethical alignment around purpose and governance and packaging. So the idea that that connected to more granular measures of good, if I put on my Goodstart early learning hat, then we think, and there's some evidence, that if we do a better job of quality, there's a virtuous circle of higher demand for places in our centre. So it actually has a commercial benefit. If I put a taxpayer hat on, I don't think it's unreasonable for us to get the marginal advantages that we do out of payroll tax and so on, for that to be subject to continuing evidence of granular performance on delivering the public good. So, you know, it's back really to the point that Rosemary made. The more granular and explicit we are about fusing business performance and granular social performance, the more we're likely to create that space of finding transactions that pass financial return muster and deliver measurable taxpayer benefits, and that's a big universe.
We might wrap up because I can see the next panel about to land. Any final parting pieces of wisdom from Rosemary, Cath, Michael?
My final word would be to point you all to some collective wisdom of the Impact Management Project, which has been a collaboration of over 1,000 practitioners around the world. They have worked with beneficiaries on 7 continents and in how they experience impact, and worked with investors to look at how they can think about the kind of capital they have, how they allocate it. There are some fantastic resources there, and it is all available as open source, and it is really illuminating because it has taken all the language and labels out and just used plain language to talk about what are we trying to do, who are we trying to assist through doing that or work with through doing that, how much are we trying to do, and what contribution do we want that to make, with a whole lot of practical measures around it. So I would really encourage everyone to take a look at the resources available.
Having sat at a very lot of roundtables and talk fests before, I think my advice is to start somewhere, you know, find something that makes sense to your organisation, find the right partners, find something that's happening in community that you can build upon, and start somewhere and learn from that, learn from your failures as well as your successes. But, you know, the days of sitting around talking about this are far gone. If we don't act now, you know, we've got burgeoning prison populations, we're locking people up. It's going to keep going on until we say no, enough's enough.
And my chip shot is, if CEDA are kind enough to invite this panel back in 5 years, we'll hopefully be talking about a $30 to $50 billion market. My gratuitous encouragement is that many of you in this room can actually contribute more significantly than you realise to that happening.
Thank you. And look, I won't go into it, but I wrote an article this month that's published in the Mandarin called Marshmallows, Moral Courage and Leadership. And the point about that was about moral courage and leadership for social good, for a stronger future, more inclusive society. And we have 3 of those leaders that have shown enormous moral courage for future social good in the panel this afternoon. So please join me in thanking Rosemary, Cath and Michael for a great session.